Jack Weston didn't go to the station anymore. He used to. He used to stand there with his hat in his hands and something close to hope sitting in his chest. But hope had made a fool of him twice, so he sent his ranch hand instead. He stayed home and waited for the sound of wagon wheels and the silence that would follow when she saw the place and decided she wasn't staying. He was already preparing for that silence when Lena Turner stepped off the wagon and didn't look away. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer Jack Weston turned 38, the town of Colton Creek had already written him off as a man who couldn't be loved by a woman willing to stay. It wasn't said cruelly. Or maybe it was. Small towns had a way of dressing cruelty up in pity and calling it concern. The women at the dry goods store would lower their voices when they saw Jack's wagon roll past, and someone would always say the same thing. Bless his heart. That poor man just wasn't built for marriage, as if marriage were a skill. Some men simply lacked, like needlepoint or fine conversation. Jack had heard it enough times that he'd stopped arguing with it. He had sent for 2 brides by mail in 3 years. The first, a woman named Clara from Pennsylvania, had lasted 4 days. She'd arrived on a Tuesday, taken one long look at the ranch. The cracked porch boards, the vast silence of the mountain pressing in from all sides. The way Billy rocked back and forth in the doorway humming to himself, and by Saturday morning, she was gone. Didn't even leave a note. Just her bonnet hanging on the peg by the door like a small white flag of surrender. The second, a woman named Ruth from Illinois, had been harder. She'd lasted 6 days. She'd cooked for them. Done. The washing smiled at Jack over the dinner table in a way that almost made him believe it was going to work. Then she'd met Billy properly. Not just passed him in a doorway, but sat across from him at breakfast, while he arranged and rearranged the same 3 spoons for 45 minutes without stopping, and something in her face had closed like a door being gently but firmly shut. She'd left on a Sunday. She'd been polite about it. That almost made it worse. After Ruth, Jack stopped going to the station. He told himself it was practical. He had work to do. The ranch didn't run on sentiment. The cattle didn't care about his romantic failures, and neither did the fence line that needed mending along the eastern ridge. There was always something that needed doing, and Jack Weston was, if nothing else, a man who kept himself busy. But the truth? The truth! He turned over in his hands some nights when Billy was asleep, and the house was too quiet, and the dark came pressing in, was that he couldn't stand to stand there with hope in his chest again. Couldn't stand to watch a woman step off a wagon and calculate in the first 30 seconds what she was and wasn't willing to endure. He'd seen it happen twice. He didn't have the stomach for a 3rd time. So, he sent Hector. Hector Ramos had worked the ranch for 11 years and had the good grace never to say more than what needed saying. Jack had handed him the paper with the train arrival time, told him to bring the woman to the ranch in the buckboard, and gone back inside to fix the hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been loose for 2 weeks. He was still working on the hinge when he heard the wagon come up the road. He didn't go out. He heard the wheels stop. He heard Hector's boots on the ground. He heard a second set of boots, lighter, deliberate, and then the sound of something heavy being set down. A trunk, maybe. Not a small one. Jack set his screwdriver on the counter. He told himself he wasn't listening. He went on telling himself that right up until he heard the front door open and Hector's voice say, "Mr. Weston, she's here." Jack turned around. The woman standing in his doorway was not what he had expected. He wasn't entirely sure what he had expected. The advertisement had been simple enough, he hadn't asked for particulars. But she wasn't it. She was tall, taller than Clara had been, taller than Ruth. Broad-shouldered in a way that wasn't delicate. Her dress was plain dark cotton, the kind a woman wore when she meant to work, not to be looked at. Her hair was the color of autumn, pulled back tight and practical at the base of her neck. Her face was not a face that had been sheltered from weather or worry. But it was her eyes that stopped him. She was looking at him the way a woman looks at a fence line she's already decided she can fix. not sizing him up for pleasure or approval. Assessing, deciding what needed doing and whether she was the person to do it. "Mr. Weston," she said. Her voice was flat and direct like a handshake. "I'm Lena Turner. I came from Zanesville, Ohio. Your advertisement said you needed a capable woman. I am one." Jack stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "You want some water? It's a long ride from the station." "I'd rather see the property first," she said, "if it's all the same to you." It was not, in fact, all the same to him. But before he could say so, she had stepped past him into the kitchen, set her traveling bag on the table, and was already looking at the cabinet he'd been trying to fix. "That hinge needs replacing," she said. "Not just tightening. The wood's stripped at the top screw. You'll need to fill it and let it dry before you can mount anything new." Jack looked at the cabinet. Then he looked at her. "I know what it needs," he said. "All right," she said without any particular apology in her voice. "Then you've got the parts, and you've been choosing not to fix it. Fair enough?" He didn't have an answer for that, mostly because she was right. From somewhere down the hall came the low, tuneless sound of Billy humming. Jack watched her face. He watched it the way he'd learned to watch carefully braced, because that was the moment. That was always the moment. The hum reached her, and he waited for her expression to shift, the way it always shifted, that involuntary flicker of something between discomfort and pity that people could never quite hide no matter how hard they tried. Lena Turner turned her head toward the sound, listened, and then, without a word, without any expression he could interpret as discomfort, she turned back to the cabinet and said, "How old is your boy?" 12. Jack said carefully. "What does he like?" The question landed strangely. Nobody asked that. They asked what's wrong with him, or they said I heard about him, or they did what Ruth had done and just got quiet and careful in a way that told you everything. Nobody asked what he liked. "Spoons," Jack said after a moment. "Smooth things. He likes things that are smooth and regular. He's partial to the sound of rain." Lena nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable information, which it was, but not everyone seemed to understand that. "I'd like to meet him," she said. "When you think it's a good time." "He doesn't always—" Jack stopped, started again. "He don't always do well with new people." "I'm not in a rush," she said. Jack watched her for another moment. Then he picked up his screwdriver and put it in his pocket. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the rest of the house." The ranch had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a front room with a stone fireplace, and a back porch that looked out toward the mountain. Jack showed her all of it in about 4 minutes, which was approximately how long it took to walk through without commentary. Lena asked questions, practical questions. Where did the well water come from? How many head of cattle? Was the barn sound, or did it have the rot problem she'd noticed on the south-facing wall from the road? "It's got some rot," Jack admitted. "Nothing that's going to fall down tomorrow. But eventually, yeah." She nodded and kept walking. The room he showed her last was the one she'd stay in if she stayed, across the hall from Billy's. He opened the door and stepped back and waited. Lena walked in and looked around. The room had a bed, a washstand, a window that let in the western light. Nothing else. "It'll do," she said. "That's it," Jack said. "That's all you've got to say about it." She turned around and looked at him with those frank, direct eyes. "What would you like me to say, Mr. Weston?" "I don't know." "The other women?" He stopped. "I'm not the other women," she said. Not unkindly, not like a challenge either. Just like a fact she was setting down on the table between them so they both knew where they stood. Jack looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I reckon you're not." He introduced her to Billy before supper. Billy was sitting on the floor of his room, which was where he spent most of his afternoons with his collection of smooth river stones, arranged in a pattern that Jack had long since stopped trying to understand, but had learned to protect from disruption. Billy was 11, would be 12 in September, And he had his mother's dark eyes, and his father's stubbornness, and a mind that worked in ways that neither Jack nor any Dr. Jack had ever managed to bring out to the ranch had been able to fully explain. He understood things. Jack was sure of that. He understood more than people gave him credit for. He just didn't communicate it the way other people expected him to. And that gap between what Billy understood and what the world was willing to receive had been the source of more grief in Jack Weston's life than anything else he could name. Jack crouched in the doorway. "Billy," he said quietly. "There's someone I want you to meet." Billy didn't look up. He moved one stone slightly to the left and hummed. "Her name's Lena. She's come to stay with us for a while." Still no look up, but the humming changed pitch just slightly the way it always did when Billy was paying attention to something he didn't want to show he was paying attention to. Jack heard Lena step up beside him. He tensed slightly, waiting. She didn't push into the room. She didn't crouch down and try to make herself smaller and less threatening the way adults did with children they didn't understand. She just stood in the doorway at her full height and said in a normal, even tone, "Those are good stones." Billy's hand stilled. "The gray one in the center," she said. "Is that granite? The ones with the flecks?" A long pause. Then very slowly, Billy's head turned. He looked at her hand first, then up her arm, then finally at her face. His eyes were sharp and evaluating in the way that always unsettled strangers who expected a blank stare and got something closer to examination. Lena met his gaze evenly and waited. Billy reached out and picked up the gray stone. He held it out toward her. Jack had not moved. He was not sure he was breathing. Lena reached forward and accepted the stone with both hands, turned it over once. "Heavy," she said. "Good weight to it." She handed it back. "Thank you for letting me see it." Billy took the stone back and set it precisely where it had been. Then he went back to humming, but softer now. Quieter. Different. Jack stood up. He didn't say anything for a moment. His throat felt strange. "He's never done that," he said finally when they were back in the hall. He's never handed one of his stones to anybody." Lena glanced at him. "I didn't touch anything," she said. "I just looked." "That's what I'm saying," Jack said. "Most people don't think to do that." She looked at him with that same level expression. Something in it shifted just slightly, not softening exactly, something that acknowledged what he'd said without making a production of it. "I'll start supper," she said. Meh. Over the next few days, Jack Weston found himself doing something he had trained himself out of watching. He watched Lena, the way you watched a thing you weren't sure was real yet. She was up before him every morning, which nobody had ever been in his adult life. She had strong opinions about the right way to cure bacon and weaker ones about everything else, which was a ratio Jack found surprisingly comfortable. She fixed the kitchen cabinet on the second day using a method she explained in detail while she was doing it as if she expected him to be paying attention, which he was. She had brought 3 books in her trunk, and one of them was a medical text, which was not the kind of book Jack would have thought to put in the same category as a trunk full of personal belongings. He'd mentioned it one evening because he couldn't help himself. "You carry a medical book when you travel." "I carry it everywhere," she said. "My father was a doctor. I grew up reading his library." Jack was quiet for a moment. "Where's your father now?" She kept her eyes on the mending she was doing. "Gone," she said. 4 years ago, fever." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She tied a knot, cut the thread. "It changed things. We had a house in Zanesville, and a practice and a life. And then he was gone, and there was debt we didn't know about, and a man I was supposed to marry who decided the debt was a good reason to change his mind." She said all of this in the same flat, factual voice she used for everything, but her hands had gone still on the mending. "So I sold the house and the furniture and settled what I could, and then I answered your advertisement." Jack turned his hat in his hands. "That's a lot of settling." Most lives are, she said, and picked up the mending again. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. But he thought about it later. Lying awake listening to the mountains settle, and Billy breathing evenly down the hall, thought about a woman who had lost her whole life and walked straight into someone else's hard one and started fixing kitchen cabinets and talking to his boy about rocks. He didn't know what to make of her. He did know that the house felt different. Not softer exactly, not easier, but less hollow. On the 5th day, she asked him why the other women had left. They were on the back porch after supper, the heat of the day finally bleeding off the mountains dark against the darker sky. Jack had a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Lena had brought her mending out, which she tended to do in the evenings. "That's a blunt question," he said. "I find blunt questions waste less time than the other kind." She looked up at him. "I'm not asking to be cruel. I'm asking because I think you believe I'm going to leave too, and I'd like to understand what you think is going to make me." Jack set his cup down on the porch rail. He was quiet for long enough that the night sounds filled in around them, the insects, something moving in the brush beyond the fence, the faint hum from Billy's window where he'd gone to bed early. "Clara left because she was lonely," he said. "The isolation out here, it's not for everybody. I understood that." "And the other one?" "Ruth." He looked out at the dark. "Ruth left because of Billy." Lena was quiet. "She didn't say it," Jack said. "She was too polite to say it outright. But I've been a parent for 12 years, and I know the difference between a person who looks at my son and sees a child, and a person who looks at him and sees a problem they hadn't signed up for." He picked up his coffee cup again. "She saw a problem." "And you think I will too," Lena said. "I don't know what you'll do," he said. "I don't know you yet." "That's honest." "I try to be." She set her mending in her lap and looked at him. "Mr. Weston, I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plainly, not kindly, because I don't do things kindly when plain will serve better." She waited until he was looking at her. "Your son is one of the most perceptive children I have ever encountered. He knows things about the people around him that those people don't know about themselves. The reason he handed me that stone is not because I was gentle with him. It's because he looked at me and decided I wasn't going to pretend to understand something I didn't." She held his gaze. "I am not going to leave because of Billy. I need you to know that." Jack looked at her for a long time. The thing in his chest that he had been pressing down since the moment the wagon came up the road, that thing that felt dangerously close to hope, shifted. He didn't trust it yet. He'd been wrong before. He'd been wrong twice, and both times it had cost him something he hadn't entirely gotten back. But it shifted. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and picked up her mending. They sat in silence while the night came all the way down around the ranch, and for the first time in longer than Jack could cleanly remember, the silence didn't feel like something pressing in from outside. It felt like something held. He didn't say anything more about it. Neither did she. But Billy hummed from his window above them, low and steady, and utterly content. And Jack Weston sat with his cold coffee and his quieted chest, and watched the mountain in the dark, and thought that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about what he could and couldn't endure. He hoped he was wrong. He was afraid to find out. But for the first time in 3 years, the hoping felt like something he might be able to survive. The week turned without fanfare. Jack Weston was not a man who marked time by feeling. He marked it by work fence posts, driven water-hauled cattle moved from one pasture to another when the grass thinned. The ranch kept its own calendar indifferent to anything as soft as emotion, and Jack had always been grateful for that. It gave him something to press against when everything else felt like open air. But that week, he noticed things. He noticed that Lena was up at 4:30, which was 30 minutes before him, and that she did it quietly. No lamp carried loudly down the hall. No floorboards tested carelessly. She moved through the dark house, the way someone moved through a space they'd decided to respect. He noticed that she'd begun leaving Billy's breakfast separate from the general table, the same food, same portions, but arranged on a smaller plate, sat at the far end of the counter, near the window, without being asked to, without mentioning it, as if she'd simply observed the way Billy ate better when he wasn't required to sit across from new things, and acted accordingly. He noticed all of it, and he didn't say anything, because saying something felt like it would break whatever fragile arrangement was currently holding the house together. On the 8th day, Hector Ramos pulled him aside by the barn. "You know the whole town's talking," Hector said without preamble. He was a man who'd worked alongside Jack long enough to have dispensed with the kind of careful lead-up other people felt was necessary. "The town's always talking," Jack said. "They're saying she won't last the month. They said that about the last two. They're also saying—" Hector stopped, and the pause had weight in it. "They're saying Victor Weston rode through Colton Creek last Friday, asking questions at the saloon." Jack went still. He had his hand on a fence post, and he kept it there, kept his face level, but something moved through him that was not quite anything he could name cleanly. "What kind of questions?" "The kind a man asks when he's building a case," Hector said. "About Billy, about the ranch, about whether a single man with a boy like Billy ought to be left to manage on his own." Jack let go of the fence post. "Victor's got no claim on this land or that boy." "No legal claim," Hector said, and let that sit for a moment. "But he's got friends who are lawyers and a mouth that don't quit. And last time I heard, he was sending letters to the county seat about the conditions here." Jack turned and looked at the house. Lena was visible through the kitchen window, moving with her usual deliberate efficiency. Billy was somewhere inside. He could hear the faint familiar hum, even from out here. "When did you plan on telling me this?" Jack said. "I'm telling you now," Hector said. "I wanted to be sure before I said it." Jack didn't answer. He picked up the post digger and went back to work, which was how he handled most things that felt too large to stand still with. But his mind didn't follow his hands. His mind stayed with Victor, with the image of his uncle riding through town, buying drinks, asking questions, in that smooth, rehearsed way he had, planting seeds of doubt in people who were already inclined to grow them. Victor Weston had been a problem since the day Jack's father died, and left the ranch to Jack instead of to his younger brother. Victor had contested the will. He'd lost. He'd gone quiet for years after that, which Jack had mistaken for acceptance, but which he now understood had simply been patience. He'd been watching, waiting for a crack. And now he apparently believed he'd found one. Jack didn't tell Lena that night. He sat across from her at supper and ate the food she'd made, a stew that was better than anything he'd put together in the past year, and watched Billy eat his portion from the counter by the window, and told himself he'd handle Victor the same way he handled every other threat to this ranch, directly and alone. He told himself that for 3 days. On the 4th day, he came in from the east pasture at noon and found Lena sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her and an expression on her face that he hadn't seen from her before. It was not quite anger. It was more controlled than anger. It was the face of a person who had already decided what they were going to do and was simply waiting for the right moment to do it. "Someone left this on the porch," she said, and pushed the paper toward him. Jack picked it up. It was written in a neat, practiced hand. Not a rough note, a considered one. It said in careful language that a concerned party had informed the county authorities that the minor child William Weston was being raised in conditions unsuitable for a child of his particular needs, and that an inquiry had been opened into the matter, and that a representative would be visiting the property within the fortnight to conduct an assessment. At the bottom, in smaller letters, "In the interest of the child's welfare, it is strongly recommended that appropriate arrangements be considered now rather than after official determination." Jack set the paper down. "Victor," he said. "I assumed," Lena said. "Tell me about him." And because there was no point anymore in the strategy of handling things alone, Jack sat down and told her. He told her about the will and the contested inheritance, and the years of quiet hostility that had passed between them like a debt neither of them ever stopped counting. He told her about Victor's lawyers and Victor's money, and Victor's particular talent for making personal grievances sound like moral concerns. Lena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He wants the land." He's always wanted the land. And Billy is the lever he's using to get at it. That's how I read it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happens to Billy if a county official comes out here and decides this isn't a fit home?" Jack's jaw tightened. There are institutions. Places where they send children who are... He stopped. Started again. Places where they send children whose families the state has decided can't manage them. The silence that followed that sentence was not the comfortable kind they'd found on the porch a few nights before. This one had edges. "That is not going to happen," Lena said. Her voice was quiet and even, and absolutely without doubt. And something about the way she said it, not as a hope, not as a wish, but as a simple statement of what would and would not occur, reached right past Jack's defenses and grabbed something he hadn't let anybody touch in years. "You don't know what Victor's capable of," he said. "No," she said. "But he doesn't know what I'm capable of either." She went into town the next morning. Jack didn't ask her to. She told him she was going, told him she'd be back by midday, and took the buckboard out before he'd fully processed the information. He spent the next 4 hours working the barn with one ear on the road, which was not a thing he intended to do, and could not seem to stop doing. She was back before noon as promised. She came inside, set her bag on the table, and sat down. "I spoke to Judge Hartley," she said. Jack stared at her. Hartley's been on the circuit bench for 20 years. He doesn't just... "How did you get in to see Hartley?" "I knocked on his door," she said. "His wife answered. She's from Ohio. We had a conversation, and then she brought me inside." Jack sat down slowly. "And he can't do anything about the county inquiry officially. But he told me off the record that the determining factor in any such assessment is typically the stability of the home. A married household with 2 capable adults is considerably harder to challenge than a single man raising a child alone." She met his eyes. "You need a wife, Mr. Weston. Not eventually. Before that assessor arrives." The room went very quiet. Jack heard Billy humming down the hall. He heard the sound of the wind coming around the corner of the house. He heard his own heartbeat doing something irregular in his chest. "That's not," he started. "I know what it is," Lena said. "I'm not confused about what I'm suggesting. I'm not asking you to pretend anything or promise anything beyond what the situation requires. But that boy is not going to an institution because his father didn't have someone standing beside him when it counted." Jack stood up and walked to the window. He put his hands on the counter and looked out at the yard and tried to get his breathing to behave itself. "You'd do that," he said. "You'd marry a man you've known for less than 2 weeks." "I've known men for years who were worth considerably less," she said. "And I've been watching you with that boy for 11 days. I know what kind of man you are." He turned around. "You don't know everything." "I don't need everything," she said. "I need enough, and I have enough." His hands were still on the counter. He looked at her across the room, this woman who'd walked into his life with a trunk full of medical books and blunt questions and an opinion about his cabinet hinges. And he thought about Clara's bonnet on the peg and Ruth's quiet exit on a Sunday morning, and the way he'd stood in this same kitchen twice before and watched something he'd hoped for walk right back out the door. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I noticed," she said without any particular concern in her voice. "And Billy is not a reason not to do this," she said. "He is the reason to do it. And I think you know that." He did know that. That was the thing that made it impossible to argue with. He did know it, and she knew he knew it, and standing here trying to find reasons was just him looking for a place to put his fear because he didn't know where else it was supposed to go. "All right," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "All right, we'll do it." Lena nodded. "I'll speak to Reverend Collins in the morning." "Lena." He said her name and she looked at him, and he didn't know exactly what he meant to say, only that something needed to be said that acknowledged the size of what she was offering. "This is more than you signed up for." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not quite grief, not quite warmth, but something that contained both. "Most things worth doing are," she said. They married on a Thursday. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony in his parlor with his wife and Hector as witnesses. It took 11 minutes. Jack wore his good shirt which Lena had pressed the night before without commenting on it. Lena wore her second-best dress, which was still plain dark cotton, but had small white buttons down the front that Jack hadn't noticed before. Billy did not attend because Reverend Collins' parlor was a new space full of strange sounds and surfaces, and Lena had decided quietly, and without consulting Jack, that it was better for Billy to stay home with a neighbor woman she'd arranged, and to be told about it after gently in the kitchen with his stones in reach. Jack had said when she'd told him this plan, "That's good thinking." Lena had said, "I know." After the ceremony, Collins had shaken Jack's hand and said, "You've got yourself a formidable woman, Jack." And Jack had looked at Lena, who was already thanking Collins's wife with that efficient, unsentimental courtesy she brought to everything, and thought that formidable was the most accurate word anyone had ever applied to a person in his presence. They rode home without much conversation. The road back to the ranch was dusty, and the sun was high and merciless, and neither of them seemed to feel the need to fill the silence with words that weren't ready yet. When they came up the drive, Billy was on the porch steps. The neighbor woman was a few feet behind him, looking apologetic, clearly having been unable to convince him to stay inside. Billy had his 3 smoothest stones in his hand. He was watching the road. He watched them climb down from the buckboard. He looked at Jack, then at Lena, then back at Jack. "She came back," Billy said. It was one of his longest sentences. Jack felt something catch in his chest. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "She came back." Billy considered this. Then he walked down the porch steps and stood in front of Lena and held out the 3 stones, all 3 of them. Not just the one open-palmed, the way you'd offer something you'd decided the other person needed to see. Lena looked down at them for a moment. Then she crouched down to Billy's level, something almost nobody ever did. Something that took real intention, and she looked at each stone carefully and said, "The gray one's granite. The pale one's quartz, I think. And that last one I'm not sure. Do you know?" Billy stared at her. Then he shook his head slowly. "Maybe we can find out," she said. "There might be a book." Billy took the stones back, but he didn't walk away. He stood there beside her, while she straightened up, and then he turned and went back up the porch steps, humming with that particular variation in tone that Jack had learned over 12 years to recognize as something close to contentment. Jack watched his son go inside. He didn't say anything. He didn't trust his voice at that particular moment to do what he needed it to do. Lena stood beside him. She didn't say anything either. She just looked at the door Billy had gone through and folded her hands in front of her and breathed. "Thank you," Jack said finally. He meant it to cover more than one thing. Lena glanced at him sideways. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Victor's still out there." "I know. And the assessor's coming." "I know that too." She looked back at the house. "Then we'd better get to work." And that was all she said about it. She turned and went up the porch steps with that same purposeful, unornamented stride she brought to everything, and Jack stood in the yard for another moment in the summer heat, listening to the sound of his son humming inside his home, and thought that whatever came next, Victor the assessor, the county's scrutiny, all of it, he was going to face it with something he hadn't had before. He had somebody standing beside him, and for the first time in a very long time, the ground beneath his feet felt like it might actually hold. But 3 days later, Victor Weston rode up the drive in a pressed suit with a man Jack didn't recognize beside him, and the expression on his uncle's face was not the expression of a man who intended to be reasonable. It was the expression of a man who believed he had already won. Victor Weston did not dismount immediately. That was the first thing Jack noticed. He sat up on that horse in his pressed suit and his polished boots and looked at the ranch the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him, taking his time about it, letting the silence do the work of establishing who had the power in this particular moment. Jack walked out to meet him. He didn't hurry. The man beside Victor was younger, mid-30s, clean-shaved, carrying a leather satchel across his shoulder that had the look of something that held official documents. A lawyer or something close enough to one that the distinction didn't matter. "Victor," Jack said. "Jack?" Victor climbed down from his horse. He was a lean man in his 60s with gray at his temples and the kind of face that had learned long ago how to look concerned without actually being concerned. "You're looking well. Ranch looks—" He paused, glanced around deliberately. "Manageable." "It is," Jack said. "What do you want?" Always so direct. Victor smiled. It was a thin, practiced thing. "This is Mr. Gerald Pruitt. He's an advocate with the county's child welfare office. Gerald, this is my nephew, Jack Weston." Pruitt extended his hand. Jack shook it without warmth. "Mr. Weston, I want to be clear that this is an informal visit, simply an initial assessment." "You wrote a letter," Jack said. "That didn't feel informal." "The letter was a formality," Pruitt said smoothly. "We find it's easier to have a conversation in person before anything becomes official. Gentlemen," all three of them turned. Lena had come out of the house. She walked down the porch steps at her usual pace, unhurried, deliberate, and crossed the yard and came to stand beside Jack, with the same self-possession she brought to everything. She'd taken off her apron. Her hands were at her sides. "I'm Lena Weston," she said. She didn't extend her hand to Victor. She extended it to Pruitt. "Mr. Pruitt, I believe I'm glad you came in person. It saves us a trip to the county office, which we were prepared to make this week regardless." Pruitt blinked slightly. He was not, Jack suspected, accustomed to being greeted by a woman who sounded like she'd been expecting him and had already made plans around his visit. "Mrs. Weston," he said. Yes, I wasn't aware Mr. Weston had recently—" "Married," Lena said. "3 days ago. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony. His wife and our ranch hand, Hector Ramos, were witnesses. I'm happy to provide documentation." Victor's expression did not change, but something behind it did, something recalculated. "Congratulations," he said, and the word came out smooth and dry and utterly without meaning. "Thank you," Lena said with exactly the same tone. Jack looked between them and felt for the first time since Victor had ridden up the drive that the ground was slightly more even than he'd feared. "Perhaps we could speak inside," Pruitt said. "I have some questions about the child's living situation." "Billy is inside," Lena said. "He has a routine in the afternoons and disrupting it would be counterproductive for everyone involved, including your assessment. I suggest we speak here." She looked at Pruitt directly. "Unless you have an objection." Pruitt did not have an objection. Ted. Victor let Pruitt ask the questions which told Jack something. Victor was smart enough to keep himself at a remove to let the official process carry the weight while he stood slightly back and watched with those flat, calculating eyes. It was the same thing he'd done during the will contest. Let the lawyer speak, position himself as a concerned party rather than an aggressor. Pruitt had a list of questions. He worked through them methodically. The size of the property, the household income, the daily care arrangements for Billy, the nature of Billy's condition, what medical attention he received, whether he attended any schooling. Jack answered the ones he could. Lena answered the rest. She did it without hesitation, without the kind of careful hedging that would have signaled to a man like Pruitt that something was being managed or concealed. She answered like a woman who had lived in this house for years and knew every detail of it and saw no reason to dress any of it up. "Billy attends no formal schooling," she said when Pruitt asked. "The nearest school is 12 miles, and the environment there, the noise, the number of children, the unstructured social requirements would cause him significant distress without producing any measurable educational benefit. He learns here. I teach him. I have a background in reading and mathematics, and my father was a physician. I am more than adequately equipped to address his educational and developmental needs." "You've been married 3 days," Victor said. He spoke quietly from his position slightly behind Pruitt. "That's a significant claim to make about a child you've known for a fortnight." "I've been here 18 days, Lena said without turning to look at him. She kept her eyes on Pruitt. "In those 18 days, Billy has made measurable progress in tolerating new people in his space, has extended his spoken vocabulary by at least 4 words in conversation with me, and has begun accepting food from a plate set at the kitchen table rather than only the counter. Progress happens quickly when the environment is consistent, and the adults around a child are paying attention." She paused. "I am paying attention." Pruitt was writing something in his notebook. Victor said, "A child with Billy's particular difficulties requires specialized care, professional care, the kind that can only be provided in a facility equipped to—" "Don't," Jack said. One word, flat and final, and something in the tone of it made even Pruitt stop writing. Victor looked at him. "Jack, you rode out here in a pressed suit with a county man and a satchel full of papers, and you're going to stand in my yard and tell me my son needs to be put in an institution." Jack took one step forward, just one. "Say it out plain, Victor. Stop hiding behind welfare concerns and say what you actually mean." Victor's chin lifted slightly. "I'm concerned about the child's welfare." "You are not," Jack said. "You have never once in 11 years asked about Billy's welfare. You didn't come to his mother's funeral. You didn't send a letter when he was born. The first time you showed a single sign of interest in that boy was 6 months ago when Hector told me you'd hired a lawyer and started making inquiries about the eastern property line." He held his uncle's gaze. "This is about the land. It has always been about the land. And you figured out that the fastest way to get me off this ranch is to take the one thing that keeps me on it." The yard was very quiet. Pruitt had stopped writing entirely. Victor said carefully, "That's a serious accusation." "It's a true one," Jack said. "And I think Mr. Pruitt is smart enough to have noticed by now that the man who filed the initial welfare complaint is the man who stands to inherit this property if I can't hold on to it." Pruitt's eyes moved to Victor, just briefly, but they moved. Victor's expression tightened at the corners. "The complaint was filed out of genuine concern." "Do you have children, Mr. Pruitt?" Lena said. Pruitt looked at her slightly startled. Yes. 2 daughters." "Then you know," she said, "what it looks like when a parent loves their child. Not the tidy kind of love that's easy to explain to a county office, the kind that gets up at 2 in the morning when a boy is frightened of something nobody else can see, the kind that learns over years what sounds mean comfort and what sounds mean distress, the kind that rearranges an entire life, an entire way of being, around making sure one child is safe and known and valued." She let that sit for a moment. "That is what Jack Weston has done for 11 years, she said, "and what I intend to spend the rest of my life helping him continue to do." Pruitt looked at her, then at Jack. Then he closed his notebook. "I'll need to see the boy briefly," he said. "Informally. I won't disrupt his routine, but I need to be able to report that I observed him directly." "Of course," Lena said. "Give us 5 minutes to prepare him." Anj. She went inside alone. Jack stayed in the yard with Victor and Pruitt, and the silence among the 3 of them was the kind that nobody felt inclined to fill. Victor had retreated behind his careful neutral expression. Pruitt was looking at his own notebook as if reconsidering some of what he'd written. 5 minutes passed. Lena appeared in the doorway. "You can come in now," she said to Pruitt. "Just you, please." Victor started forward. Lena looked at him. She didn't say anything. She simply looked at him, and whatever was in that look made him stop and reconsider and stay where he was. Jack almost said something about it later. But later, when he thought about it, he realized there was nothing to say. She'd simply looked at the man, and the man had stopped. That was a particular kind of power, and it didn't need commentary. Pruitt went inside. He was out again in less than 10 minutes. He came down the porch steps and stood in the yard and looked at his notebook, and then looked at Victor with an expression that had changed significantly from the one he'd arrived with. "The boy seemed settled," he said. "The home environment appears stable." "Appeared stable," Victor said quietly. "He's been here 18 days. Appearances can be constructed." "Mr. Weston," Pruitt addressed Jack, "I'll file my report this week. I won't be recommending any immediate action." He paused. "I would suggest, however, that you document your care arrangements going forward, formally. It protects you, and it protects the child." "I understand," Jack said. "Thank you." Pruitt nodded, mounted his horse, and rode back down the drive without further conversation. Victor didn't move. Jack watched him, waited. "You think you've solved something," Victor said finally. His voice was quiet now, the performance of concern stripped away. This was the real voice, the one underneath. "You've married a woman you barely know to create the appearance of a stable household. The county office will check back. They always do. And when they come back and find—" "What?" Jack said. "What is it you think they're going to find, Victor?" "Trouble," Victor said simply. "Trouble has a way of finding you, Jack. Always has." "Get off my property," Jack said. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the house. Then slowly, he mounted his horse. "I'm not finished with this," he said. "I didn't think you were," Jack said. Victor rode away. Jack stood in the yard until the sound of the horse was gone. Then he turned around and went up the porch steps and into the house, and Lena was standing in the kitchen with Billy sitting at the counter behind her, arranging his stones, humming to himself in that low, satisfied register that meant he was at ease. "How did you settle him that fast?" Jack said. "I told him the man coming in was going to look at his stones and then leave," Lena said. "And that's exactly what happened. Billy understands sequences. You tell him what's coming in order he can handle most things." Jack stared at her. "How did you know that?" She looked at him with those direct eyes. "Because I watched him for 18 days, she said. "Same as I told Pruitt." Jack pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands and stayed that way for a moment. Not in despair exactly, but in the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding his body rigid for hours and has just been given permission to stop. "He's not done," Jack said from behind his hands. "No." Lena agreed. She sat down across from him. "He's going to come at this from a different angle. The county route didn't work the way he planned, so he'll try something else." Jack dropped his hands, looked at her. "You think he'll try the land directly?" "He can't take the land as long as you're living and working it. But if he can create enough legal disruption, enough uncertainty around the property lines or the title, he can make it expensive enough and complicated enough that you'd consider selling." "I'm not selling." "I know you're not," she said. "But he doesn't need you to sell willingly. He needs you to be drowning in legal fees and court dates long enough that the ranch starts to fail. Then he makes an offer when you're underwater." She met his eyes. "That's the play." Jack looked at her. "How do you know that?" "My father's practice," she said. "When he died and the debt came out, there were men who came around very quickly with very reasonable-sounding offers. Men who'd been watching the situation and timing their approach." Something moved through her expression, brief and controlled but real. "I've seen this before, from the other side of it." And that was the moment something shifted for Jack Weston in a way he hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely account for. He'd known from the beginning that Lena was capable. He'd known she was honest and direct and practically intelligent in ways that went beyond what he'd had any right to expect from a woman who'd answered a mail-order advertisement and arrived with a trunk and a medical book. He'd known all of that for 18 days, and he'd been grateful for it in the way you're grateful for a good tool genuinely, but at a distance. But this was different. She wasn't just standing beside him. She was standing with him, understanding the threat from the inside, reading it the way someone reads it who has survived something similar, and doing it without asking for anything in return. Without making it about herself. Without taking up space that wasn't offered. He looked at her across the kitchen table and felt the distance he'd been maintaining carefully and consciously begin to close in a way he didn't know how to stop and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. "Lena," he said. "Don't," she said. He blinked. "I haven't said anything yet." "You're about to say something careful," she said. "Something about gratitude, or about not wanting me to feel obligated, or about how this isn't what I signed up for." She looked at him levelly. "Save it. I know what I'm doing. I knew what I was doing when I got off that wagon, and I knew what I was doing when I agreed to marry you, and I know what I'm doing right now. I don't need you to manage my expectations." "I wasn't." "You were," she said, but not unkindly. "You do it when you're afraid something's going to leave. You get careful. You put distance between yourself and whatever you're afraid to lose." She held his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Jack. You can stop doing that." The silence that followed had no edges in it. From the counter, Billy had arranged his stones into a new configuration, a long, careful line from one side to the other, and was humming the way he hummed when something in the world had resolved itself into a pattern that satisfied him. Jack looked at his son for a moment. Then he looked at Lena. "All right," he said. It was the same thing he'd said before, and it meant the same thing and more. "All right. So what do we do about Victor?" And just like that, she reached into the pocket of her dress and set a folded piece of paper on the table between them. Jack picked it up and unfolded it. It was a letter. Written in Lena's hand, composed some time before Victor had ever ridden up the drive, he realized. She'd written it before the visit, while he was out at the east fence in the morning. She'd been preparing before he even knew what needed to be prepared for. It was addressed to a land attorney in Cheyenne named Harlan Cross, laying out the history of the Weston property dispute in precise detail: the will, the contested inheritance, the years of quiet maneuvering, and the current welfare complaint, and requesting representation. At the bottom she'd signed it Lena Weston. Not Lena Turner. Not Mrs. Jack Weston. Lena Weston. Like she'd been signing that name her whole life. Jack read it twice. He set it back on the table. "When did you write this?" he said. "Yesterday," she said. "While you were at the fence line. I found the record of the original will dispute in your father's papers in the desk. I went through the desk after I found the county letter because I needed to understand the whole picture." She paused. "I hope that wasn't overstepping." "No," he said. The word came out with more feeling in it than he'd planned. No. She looked at him steadily. "I need your signature on it before I send it. And I need you to trust me on this, Jack. Cross has a reputation for exactly this kind of case. If anyone can put a wall between Victor and this property, it's him." Jack picked up the pen from the counter. He signed his name below hers. He set the pen down and looked at their two signatures side by side on the page, his rough and slanted, hers clean and precise, and the sight of it did something to him he couldn't have explained out loud to anyone. "Mail it tomorrow," he said. "First thing," she said. Billy stopped humming. Both of them looked over at him. He had turned on his stool and was looking at them with those sharp, assessing eyes, looking at the table, at the paper, at their hands near each other on the surface of it. He looked for a long moment. Then he picked up the center stone from his line, the gray granite one, the one he'd handed to Lena on the porch that very first day, and set it deliberately on the table between them. Then he turned back to his row and started humming again. Jack looked at the stone. He looked at Lena. Lena was looking at the stone with an expression that was doing everything it could to stay level and not entirely succeeding. "I think he approves," she said quietly. "Yeah," Jack said. His voice was rough at the edges. "I think he does." Neither of them moved the stone. It sat there on the table between their signatures, gray and smooth and solid. And it seemed to Jack, who was not generally a man given to symbolism, that it had been placed there with a great deal of intention by someone who understood more about what was happening in this kitchen than anyone had given him credit for. But that evening when Jack went to check the cattle and Lena was cleaning up the supper things, she found something else. Slipped under the back door, tucked flat against the threshold, was another piece of paper. Not from the county this time. Not official language or careful phrasing. Just 7 words written in a hand she didn't recognize. "The lawyer in Cheyenne works for me." She stood in the kitchen and read those 7 words 3 times. Then she folded the paper, put it in her pocket, and went to find Jack. Jack read the note twice. Then he set it on the table and walked to the back door and opened it and looked out into the dark. Nothing moved. Whoever had slipped it under the door was long gone, had likely been gone before Lena even found it. He closed the door. "How long ago do you think it was put there?" he said. "I don't know," Lena said. "I found it when I was cleaning up. Could have been an hour. Could have been during the visit when we were all in the front yard." Jack picked the note up again. 7 words. No signature. The handwriting was careful and anonymous, the kind of hand someone practiced when they didn't want to be recognized by it. "Victor," he said. "Or someone working for Victor," Lena said. "It doesn't matter which. What matters is what it means." "It means Harlan Cross is compromised." "It means we were about to walk into a trap," she said. "We'd have sent that letter, Cross would have taken our money, shared everything we told him with Victor, and we'd have handed him our entire legal strategy on a plate." She sat down at the table. Someone knew that. Someone who knows Victor well enough to know which lawyer he owns and cared enough to warn us. Jack looked at her. Who in Colton Creek knows Victor's business that well? Lena was quiet for a moment. "Someone who's been watching longer than we have," she said. Jack thought about it. He turned the note over in his hands, looking at the paper itself. Not fancy stock, not cheap either. The kind of paper used in a business office. Or a courthouse. "Hartley," he said. Lena's eyes met his. "The judge." "His wife's from Ohio," Jack said slowly. "You sat in their parlor for an hour. She brought you inside without knowing you, which means she made a decision about your character fast and acted on it. That's not a timid woman." He set the note down. "And Hartley's been on the circuit bench for 20 years. He'd know every lawyer in the territory and who they're beholden to." "He couldn't warn us officially," Lena said. "That would be interference." "But his wife could slip a note under a door," Jack said. They looked at each other across the table for a moment. "We need a different lawyer," Lena said. "We need one we find ourselves," Jack said. "Nobody local, nobody with any reason to have crossed paths with Victor." "Cheyenne's out," she said. "What about Denver? Denver's 3 days' ride." "Then we write letters until we find someone who isn't in Victor's pocket," she said. "And in the meantime we find out what other moves he's already made." Jack pushed back from the table and stood up. The weariness in him was the bone-deep kind, the kind that came not from physical labor, but from the sustained pressure of being in a fight where the rules kept changing. He'd worked hard days all his adult life, and he knew how to carry tired in his muscles. This was different. This was tired in the mind, in the place where he kept his defenses up. Lena was watching him. "Go get some sleep," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not," she said. "You've been holding your jaw like that since Victor rode up the drive, and it's been 6 hours. Go to sleep. I'll think better in the morning, too." He looked at her. She was right, and he knew she was right, and he was too worn down to pretend otherwise. "Lock the back door," he said. "Already did," she said. He didn't sleep well. He lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about Victor, about the way his uncle had looked at the property when he rode in that slow proprietary sweep of a man reviewing an asset. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it the day after his father's funeral, when Victor had arrived at the ranch before the ground was cold, ostensibly to pay his respects, and spent most of his time walking the fence lines. At 2 a.m, Billy's humming started from across the hall. Not the content hum, the other one. The one that meant something in the dark had disturbed him. Jack was up before he'd consciously decided to move. He went across the hall and pushed open Billy's door. Billy was sitting up in bed, with his 3 stones in his hands, rocking slightly, his eyes open and fixed on something Jack couldn't see. "Hey," Jack said quietly. He sat on the edge of the bed. "Hey, it's all right." Billy kept rocking. The hum continued. From down the hall came the sound of Lena's door opening. Her footsteps crossed to Billy's doorway and stopped. She didn't come in. She'd learned somehow in 18 days that Billy's room when he was distressed was not a space for more people to enter. She just stood in the doorway, and her presence was the kind that didn't demand anything. Billy's humming changed pitch. Not much, just enough. Jack kept his voice low. "You're in your room. You're safe. I'm right here." Billy looked at him, then past him to the doorway where Lena was standing. Something in his body settled, not completely but enough. The rocking slowed. "She's there too," Jack said. "See? Nobody's gone anywhere." Billy looked at Lena for a long moment. Then he lay back down, stones still in his hands, and closed his eyes, and within a few minutes, his breathing had evened out into sleep. Jack sat there until he was sure. Then he stood up and went back to the doorway where Lena was waiting. "Does this happen often?" she said softly. 2-3 times a week, Jack said. "Some nights more." She looked past him at Billy's sleeping form. "And you've been doing this alone for how long?" "Since his mother died," Jack said. 4 years. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted in a way that wasn't pity. It was something harder and more real than pity. It was understanding that had weight to it. "Go to sleep, Jack," she said. "You too," he said. He went back to his room. This time he slept. In the morning, Hector came to the house before breakfast. He didn't knock. In 11 years, he'd never knocked because the understanding between him and Jack was that if Hector was coming to the house early, something needed saying, and the formality of knocking would only slow it down. He came in and took his hat off and looked at both of them at the table. "Victor's been to see Elmer Crane," he said. Jack set down his coffee. Elmer Crane owned the only feed supply in Colton Creek. "About what?" "About your credit," Hector said. "Victor told Elmer you've been overextended for 2 years. Said the ranch is close to failing, and Elmer ought to think carefully about extending any more terms." The words landed like something physical. Lena said very calmly, "Is that true? About the credit?" "We've carried a balance," Jack said. "Not more than any working ranch carries. But if Elmer cuts us off..." He stopped. Started again. "Feed medicine tools. Everything we can't produce ourselves. If we lose the credit line, we lose the ability to operate." "How much do we owe Elmer currently?" Lena said. $140. "Can we pay it in full?" Jack looked at her. "We've got about 90 in the house account." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and went down the hall to her room. She came back with a small flat box that Jack had never seen her open. She set it on the table, opened it, and counted out bills onto the surface. $50. Then more. 60. 70. Jack stared. "Lena." "This is my money," she said. "From the house sale in Zanesville. I kept it because I didn't know what I was walking into when I came here. And a woman alone needs resources she controls herself." She counted out the last of it and looked up. $120. Together with your 90, that's enough to settle the full balance at Elmer's and have 70 left. "I can't take your money," Jack said. "It's not a gift," she said flatly. "I'm a partner in this ranch. I'm protecting what's mine as much as what's yours. If Victor chokes our supply line, we fail by spring regardless of what any judge decides." She held his gaze. "Let me do this." Hector was looking at a point on the wall above their heads with the practiced discretion of a man who understood that some conversations required witnesses but not participants. Jack looked at the money on the table. He looked at Lena. He thought about everything she'd already done: the letter to Cross, the visit to Hartley, the way she'd stood in the yard and handled Pruitt with a steadiness Jack himself hadn't been sure he could maintain. He thought about what it meant that she'd come here with that box of money and hadn't told him about it. Not because she was hiding it, but because it was hers, and she'd earned the right to decide when it was needed. She'd decided now. "All right," he said. "Good." She stacked the bills and pushed them to his side of the table. "Go see Elmer this morning. Pay the balance in full. Don't mention Victor. Just pay it and thank him and let it sit." "And if Elmer's already decided to cut us off," Jack said. "He hasn't," Lena said. "Victor visited yesterday. Elmer's a cautious man. He'll think about it for a week before he acts. We're getting ahead of it." Jack looked at Hector. Hector nodded once, which meant he agreed with her read. Jack picked up the money. "I'll go this morning." "Take Hector," Lena said. "Don't go alone right now." He came back 2 hours later. Elmer had taken the payment. He'd been surprised pleasantly, which told Jack that Victor's warning hadn't landed as firmly as Victor had intended. Elmer was a businessman, not a weapon, and a man who paid his balance in full was a better customer than a rumor of future failure. Lena was not in the house when Jack returned. Billy was at his counter with his stones, supervised by the neighbor woman who'd been there for the wedding. Mrs. Adler, a widow in her 60s, who had taken an uncomplicated liking to Billy and an equally uncomplicated dislike of Victor Weston, based on things she'd apparently heard at the dry goods store. "She went to town," Mrs. Adler said. "Took the horse about 40 minutes ago." Jack looked at her. "Did she say where?" "Said she had some letters to post and some questions to ask." Mrs. Adler folded her hands in her lap. "She also said if you came home and looked worried about it, I should tell you she's not fragile." Jack put his hat back on. "I know she's not fragile." "Then don't look so worried," Mrs. Adler said. Billy from his counter made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough that Jack looked over at him sharply. Billy had his face turned toward his stones, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that looked unmistakably like satisfaction. "All right," Jack said to the room in general. "All right." He waited. She was back before noon. She came in and hung up her coat and washed her hands at the basin and sat down at the kitchen table with the same composure she always had, except that there was something slightly different underneath it, something with more energy, like a current running below still water. "I spoke to 3 people," she said. "Martha Hale at the seamstress shop, Pastor Green, and Dr. Aldrich." Jack waited. "Martha Hale has been in this town for 30 years, Lena said. "She knows everyone and everything, and she has been watching Victor Weston operate for a long time. She told me that 2 years ago, Victor approached the family of a homesteader named Calloway, whose son had a difficult condition not unlike Billy's. Victor offered to help them navigate the county welfare system." She paused. "The Calloway boy ended up in an institution in Denver within 3 months. The family's land was sold to settle debts that Victor's lawyers had somehow surfaced. Victor purchased the adjacent parcel at a significant discount 6 weeks after the sale." Jack went very still. "He's done this before," he said. "At least once that Martha knows of directly," Lena said. "And she suspects there were others." She met his eyes. "This is not an uncle with a grievance, Jack. This is a man with a system." The thing that moved through Jack then was not exactly rage. It was something colder and more purposeful than rage, the feeling of a situation snapping into focus after weeks of seeing it only partially. Victor had not come at him because of old resentments about the land. Or not only that. He'd come because Jack's ranch was next on a list. Billy had simply been the available lever. "Dr. Aldrich," Jack said. "What did he say?" "He's been Billy's physician twice in the past 3 years when you brought him in," Lena said. "He remembers Billy clearly. He told me without me asking that he would testify on Billy's behalf if it came to a court proceeding. That Billy is in his professional opinion thriving in his home environment and would be significantly harmed by institutionalization." She folded her hands on the table. And Pastor Green told me that at least 6 families in this congregation would speak to Billy's good character and to yours if it came to that. Jack sat back. He looked at her. You did all of this morning. I had a list, she said. Of course you did, he said. Something moved through her expression that was close to humor, but underneath it was something more serious, and he didn't look away from it. Jack, she said, I need you to understand something. Victor is going to move fast now. He knows the county approach is damaged. He knows we're lawyering up. His next move is going to be something we don't expect, and it's going to come before we're ready for it. She leaned forward slightly. We need to be in front of a judge before Victor chooses his moment. We need to bring this to court on our terms, not his. On what grounds? Jack said. He hasn't done anything I can prove yet. The Calloway family, she said quietly. If they'll talk. Jack looked at her. Martha Hale thinks they might, Lena said. They moved to a town called Mill Haven 2 counties over. If the Calloways will testify to what Victor did to their family and doctor, Aldrich testifies to Billy's condition and needs, and 6 townspeople speak to the stability of this home. She stopped. It's not a guarantee, but it builds a picture of a man who uses welfare claims as a financial instrument, a picture that a judge with 20 years on the circuit bench might find very interesting. Hardly, Jack said. He can't take the case, but he'll know who can and who should. She held his gaze. Will you trust me on this? He looked at her for a long time. He thought about 18 days ago when she'd walked through his front door and told him his cabinet hinge needed replacing. He thought about the stones and the morning routine and the way Billy had slept after she appeared in that doorway at 2 a.m. He thought about the box of money and the letter signed Lena Weston and 7 words slipped under a door by someone who'd decided she was worth protecting. I already trust you, he said. I think I've trusted you for a while and just hadn't gotten around to saying it. Something happened in her face then. Not collapse, she was not a woman who collapsed, but a single brief moment of something that looked like relief, like a weight she'd been carrying carefully, finally being set down just for a second before she picked it back up. Good, she said. Her voice was steady. Then we ride to Millhaven on Saturday, and we find the Calloways. Together, Jack said. Together, she said. That evening, Jack was on the porch when Hector came around the side of the house with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Jack recognized as the look of a man carrying news he doesn't want to deliver. What? Jack said. Victor filed papers today, Hector said. I heard from Collins's boy, who works at the county office. Victor filed a formal petition with the court. He's requesting emergency guardianship of Billy on the grounds of parental instability. Jack stood up from his chair. He didn't wait, Hector said. He must have had those papers ready before he ever rode out here the first time. When's the hearing? Jack said. Hector's jaw tightened. 10 days. 10 days. Jack stood on the porch and the summer night pressed in around him, and he thought about Billy inside humming, arranging his stones, entirely unaware that in 10 days a judge was going to decide whether his father got to keep him. Lena appeared in the doorway behind him. She'd heard. He could tell from the set of her shoulders, from the way she came to stand beside him without being asked. Saturday's too late, she said quietly. I know, Jack said. We go tomorrow, she said. First light. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing useful left to say tonight, only the thing that had been building in him since the moment she'd handed that pen back across the table after he'd signed his name next to hers, the understanding finally without argument that whatever this was between them had long since passed the boundaries of what either of them had signed up for. She was not here because of an advertisement anymore. She was here because she had decided to be. Every single day she had decided again. And tomorrow, She was going to ride 2 counties over to find a family she'd never met and ask them to open their worst wound in front of a judge for a boy she'd known less than 3 weeks. He turned and looked at her. "Lena." She looked back at him, that direct, unguarded gaze that never flinched from what it found. "Whatever happens," he said. "Whatever the judge decides, I need you to know that—" He stopped. Words had never been his strength, and the ones he needed were bigger than his vocabulary for tenderness. "I need you to know it matters. You matter. Not because of what you're doing. Because of who you are while you're doing it." She was quiet for a moment. The night sounds filled in around them. "I know," she said, soft and certain, and without any performance in it. "I know, Jack." Billy's humming drifted through the window above them, steady and low and perfectly content. And inside that sound, in the space between what had been and what was coming, something between Jack Weston and Lena Weston became something neither one of them needed to name to know was real. But at midnight, a rider came hard up the drive and pulled up short in front of the house, and when Jack got to the door, he found one of the Collins boys, the older one 17, and breathless with a piece of paper in his shaking hand. "Mr. Weston," the boy said, "this came by wire to my father's office an hour ago. It's from Millhaven." Jack took the paper. He read it. Then he read it again. His hand dropped to his side. "Jack." Lena was behind him. "What does it say?" He turned and held the paper out to her without speaking, because the words on it had knocked something loose inside him that he didn't know how to put back quickly. She read it. He watched her face. The wire was from a man named Thomas Calloway. It said 2 things. First, that he and his wife would testify, that they had been waiting for 2 years for someone to ask. And second, that Victor Weston had been to see them that morning, that he'd offered them money to stay quiet, and that they had thrown him out of their house. Lena lowered the paper. "He knew we were coming," she said. "Before we even decided to go," Jack said. They looked at each other in the dark doorway of the ranch house, and the weight of it, the reach of Victor's network, the depth of his preparation, the fact that he had informants inside Colton Creek who were watching and reporting settled over both of them like weather. "He has someone here," Lena said. "Someone close." "Yeah," Jack said. "Who knew we'd go to Millhaven?" Jack thought about it. He ran through the morning Hector, Mrs. Adler, the people Lena had spoken to in town. Martha Hale, Pastor Green, Dr. Aldrich. "I don't know yet," he said. "We need to know before the hearing," she said. "Because if Victor has ears inside our circle, then everything we plan between now and that courtroom, he already knows." Jack took the paper back and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "Get some sleep," he said. "Jack." "We go at first light," he said. "Millhaven. Same plan. Calloway's already agreed. Whatever Victor offered them, they turned it down, which means they want to talk more than they want the money." He met her eyes. "We go. We listen. And we figure out the rest on the road." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. He sent the Collins boy home with a word of thanks and stood in the doorway a moment longer alone, looking out at the dark drive where the rider had come from. Somewhere in Colton Creek, someone who knew him well enough to be trusted was carrying his plans back to Victor Weston. And in 10 days, he was going to stand in a courtroom and fight for his son. The mountain rose in the dark ahead of him, the same as it always had, indifferent and vast and permanent. Jack Weston had lived beside it for 38 years. He had buried his father in its shadow. He had raised his son on its slopes. He had never once asked it for anything, because the mountain was not the kind of thing you asked. But standing in the doorway with the wire in his pocket and Lena's steady presence behind him, and Billy humming in his sleep down the hall, he thought just briefly, just for a moment, that he might make an exception. Tomorrow they would ride for Millhaven, and whatever came after that, they would ride into it together. They left before the sun was fully up. Mrs. Adler came at 4:30, without being asked, which told Jack that Lena had arranged it the night before, without mentioning it to him, the same way she'd prepared Billy's breakfast plate, the same way she'd written the letter to Cross before Victor had even ridden up the drive. She thought ahead of the moment she was in always. It was either the most reassuring quality Jack had ever encountered in another person, or the most humbling, and most days it was both. Billy was still asleep when they left. Lena had gone into his room and stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark, not speaking, just present. Then she'd come back down the hall and put on her coat and said, "Let's go," and they'd gone. The road to Millhaven took most of the day. They rode without talking for long stretches, which was not uncomfortable. It had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around day 3 of her being on the ranch, and Jack had stopped analyzing why. Some people you could be quiet with. It was not a common thing, and he knew better than to take it for granted. Somewhere around midday, with the sun pushing hard on their shoulders, Lena said, "I've been thinking about who talked." "So have I," Jack said. "It's not Hector." "No," Jack agreed. Hector had 11 years behind him, and Jack would have bet the East pasture on his loyalty. "Mrs. Adler only knew we were going to Millhaven because she overheard it last night," Lena said. "Too late for Victor to reach Millhaven before us by that route." "Which means someone knew earlier," Jack said, "before we decided." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Aldrich," she said. "I told him we were building a case. I told him we were looking for witnesses. I told him we needed people who knew what Victor had done before." Jack looked at her. "I didn't tell him Millhaven," she said. "But I told him enough that a man who already knew the Calloway story could have put it together." "Why would Aldrich work for Victor?" "I don't know," she said. "But I think about the way he offered to testify before I asked. Volunteered it. Made sure I'd include him in our plans." She paused. What if that was the point? What if he wanted to know who we were building toward so he could tell Victor? Jack rode in silence for a while with that. "If it's Aldrich," he said slowly, "then his testimony is worthless to us. Victor owns it." "Yes," Lena said. "Which means we lost our medical witness. Unless," she said, "we find another one." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. He'd stopped being surprised that she produced things from her coat, but only barely, and held it out to him. He took it without slowing his horse. It was a name and an address. A Dr. Franklin Webb in the town of Carey's Mill, 12 miles east of Millhaven. Martha Hale mentioned him, Lena said. He was the Calloway's doctor before they left their old home. He examined their son multiple times. He told the county at the time that the boy did not need institutionalization. Victor's lawyers discredited him on procedural grounds. She paused. He's been angry about it for 2 years. Jack folded the paper and tucked it into his own pocket. "You had this before we left." "I had it yesterday," she said. "And you didn't." "I wasn't sure we needed it until this morning," she said. "When I thought about Aldrich." She glanced at him. "I'm sorry. I should have told you about the doubt sooner." It was the first time she'd apologized for anything since she'd arrived, and the plainness of it, no hedging, no qualification. Just "I should have and I didn't" did something to his chest that he wasn't going to examine at 30 miles an hour on a dusty road. "Don't be sorry," he said. "You're still 2 steps ahead of me on most of this." She looked at him. "I'm not trying to be ahead of you." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it different." The Calloways lived in a small house on the edge of Millhaven. Thomas Calloway answered the door himself, a man in his 50s, lean with the kind of face that had been through something and come out the other side without entirely recovering. Behind him was his wife Eleanor, smaller and quieter, with eyes that watched every new person in her doorway, with the careful assessment of someone who had trusted the wrong people and was still measuring the cost. They sat at the Calloway's kitchen table, and Thomas talked. He talked for nearly an hour. He talked about their son Daniel, who was 20 now, and in a facility in Denver, and had been there for 2 years. He talked about the way Victor's first contact had seemed like help, a concerned man, a friend of the county, someone who knew people and could smooth the way through the complicated bureaucracy of welfare assessments. He talked about the lawyer Victor had provided free of charge, who had turned out to be working entirely toward an outcome that served Victor and nothing and no one else. He talked about the land sale, how it had felt inevitable by the time it happened, how they'd been so deep in legal fees and isolation by then that selling had seemed like the only door left open. He closed every other door first, Eleanor said. It was the first thing she'd said. Her voice was steady. That's what he does. He closes every door one at a time until the only one left is the one he wants you to walk through. Lena's hand moved across the table and covered Eleanor's briefly. Eleanor looked at it, then at Lena, and something in her face broke open just slightly. Not all the way, but enough. "Will you testify?" Lena asked. "We already decided yes," Thomas said. "When Victor came yesterday and offered us money, we knew we were deciding, and the money made the decision easier, not harder." His jaw tightened. A man only pays for silence when the truth can hurt him. "He's going to come at you on the stand," Jack said. "His lawyers will say you have a grievance against him, that you're motivated by resentment." "We are motivated by resentment," Thomas said. "That doesn't make us wrong." Jack looked at him across the table. Two men who'd had the same thing come for their families, one of them too late, and one of them not yet. "No," he said. "It doesn't." Before they left, they rode the extra 12 miles to Carey's mill. Dr. Webb was at home. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with ink-stained fingers and a temper that came to the surface fast when Victor Weston's name was mentioned. He agreed to testify in the time it took him to put his coat on. "I've been waiting for someone to do something about that man," he said. He said it like it was simple. Like it had always been simple, and the only thing missing had been someone willing to try. They rode home through the dark and arrived past midnight. Mrs. Adler was asleep in the front room chair. Billy was in his bed, breathing evenly, his stones arranged on the nightstand beside him in a careful line. Jack stood in the doorway of Billy's room and watched his son sleep for a long moment. Then he went to bed and slept like a man who had made a decision he intended to keep. The hearing was in 7 days, and on the 5th day they found out about Aldrich. It came from Martha Hale, who came to the ranch herself, and asked to speak to Lena, and told her what she'd heard at the dry goods store that morning, that Aldrich had been paid a retainer by Victor's law firm 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, before Victor had even ridden up the Weston Drive the first time. Before the county letter. Before the welfare petition. He had been placed there ahead of time, like a piece on a board set before the game began. Lena thanked Martha Hale and walked her to the gate and came back to the house with that particular expression, the current under still water one, and told Jack. Jack sat down. 6 weeks ago, he said. He knew we'd go looking for a doctor, Lena said. He positioned Aldrich to collect our strategy and funnel it back. How long has he been planning this? Jack said. Long enough, she said, that we need to assume he has planned for things we haven't thought of yet. Then we go to Hartley, Jack said. Not for the case, for advice, off the record, same as you did before. She looked at him. You think he'll see us? I think his wife will open the door, Jack said. Lena almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Judge Hartley's wife did open the door. She brought them inside and sat them in the parlor, and went to get her husband, and she patted Lena's hand once on the way out of the room in a way that was brief and certain and said everything. Hartley sat across from them and listened without interrupting, while Lena laid it out. Aldrich, the 6-week retainer, the Callaway pattern, the 12-year history of the land dispute. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes and without repetition, and when she finished, Hartley was quiet for a long moment. You have the Callaways willing to testify, he said. Yes, Lena said. And Webb. Yes. And you have documentation of the Aldrich retainer. Martha Hale heard it from Aldrich's own nurse, who told it in confidence, and then decided the confidence was less important than what was right, Lena said. We don't have the paper, but the nurse will speak to it. Hartley looked at Jack. Victor is going to argue that your marriage is a legal convenience, that it was entered into for the sole purpose of manufacturing a stable household for the assessment. It was entered into to protect my son, Jack said. Those aren't the same thing. In a court of law, a judge needs more than intent, Hartley said. He needs evidence of a genuine household. He needs testimony that this marriage is real in the ways that matter. Half of Colton Creek has been watching us live in the same house for 3 weeks, Jack said. Then bring half of Colton Creek, Hartley said simply. He stood up. I cannot be in that courtroom, Jack, but I can tell you who the presiding judge will be, and I can tell you that Judge Merritt spent 30 years watching men like Victor Weston use the courts as a personal instrument, and he has no patience for it. Present your evidence, present your witnesses, and let him see what kind of people you are. He paused at the doorway. The kind of people you are is not a small thing. The morning of the hearing, Billy woke up at 4 and hummed for 20 minutes in the dark, and then stopped. Jack heard the humming stop. He got up and went to the doorway. Billy was sitting up in bed with his stones not rocking, not distressed, just sitting, looking at the window. You know something's happening today, Jack said quietly. Billy didn't answer, but he picked up the gray granite stone and held it out. Jack took it. It was smooth and cool and exactly the weight it had always been. He held it for a moment, then set it back gently in Billy's palm. I'm coming back, he said. We both are. Billy closed his fingers around the stone. Jack went back to the hall. Lena was there already dressed, her coat on her hair pinned back. They didn't say anything to each other. They just went. The courtroom in Colton Creek was a single large room on the second floor of the town hall, with wooden benches that could seat 40 people and almost no ventilation in August. When Jack and Lena came in, the benches were full. Martha Hale was there. Pastor Green. Hector sat in the second row with his hat in his lap. Mrs. Adler was in the back. Thomas and Eleanor Calloway had ridden in the night before and were sitting near the window. Dr. Webb had a seat near the aisle. Aldrich was conspicuously absent. Jack had not expected any of this. He'd hoped for some of it. But to see all of them there, to see the room full of people who had come on their own on a Tuesday morning in August heat, did something to him that he was not going to be able to keep off his face, and he stopped trying. Lena took his arm briefly, just for a second, as they walked to their table. Just a hand on his arm. That was all. Victor sat at his table with 2 lawyers and the expression of a man who had done his calculations and was confident in the result. Judge Merritt came in at 9 sharp. He was older than Hartley, white-haired, with a face that had the look of a man who had heard every argument at least twice and was not interested in the decorative versions of them. We're here on a petition for emergency guardianship of one William Weston minor, Merritt said. Mr. Victor Weston petitioner. Mr. Jack Weston respondent. Let's not waste this court's morning. Petitioner, make your case. Victor's lead lawyer stood. He was smooth, experienced, the kind of advocate who knew how to make a moral argument sound like a legal one. He laid out the case, Jack's failed attempts at marriage, the instability of the household, the arrival of a woman who had been on the property for less than a month, and whose commitment to the family was, he argued, unverifiable and likely temporary. He used the word instability 7 times. Jack counted. Then Merritt looked at the respondent's table. Mrs. Weston, he said, I understand you'll be speaking for the family. Victor's lawyer started. Your Honor, the respondent is... I'll hear from Mrs. Weston, Merritt said in a tone that finished the sentence permanently. Lena stood. She did not have notes. She stood at the front of that courtroom, with 40 people behind her and Victor's lawyers across from her, and a judge who had been on the bench for 30 years, and she spoke clearly and without decoration. She told the court about Billy's stones and what they meant. She told them about 4:30 in the morning, and the hum that meant distress, and the learning over 3 weeks of what each variation in that hum communicated. She told them about the breakfast plate at the counter by the window and why. She told them about the granite stone handed to her on the porch on the second day by a child who she said understood people better than most adults she'd met. "Billy Weston is not a burden," she said. "He is not a problem to be managed or a liability to be transferred to a facility better equipped to contain him. He is a 12-year-old boy who loves smooth stones and the sound of rain and his father's voice at 2 in the morning when the dark gets to be too much." Her voice did not waver. "He is thriving, not in spite of his home, but because of it. Because of a man who has spent 11 years learning how to love a child the world doesn't know how to receive." The room was entirely silent. Victor's lawyer began his cross-examination. He asked how long she had been in the home. 23 days, Lena said. He asked how she could make such claims about a child she had known for 23 days. "Because I have been paying attention for 23 days, she said, "and attention is not a function of time." He pushed. She held. Then the Callaways testified. Thomas was on the stand for 22 minutes, and he did not flinch once. He named every date, every meeting, every document Victor's lawyers had produced, and what had actually been in them versus what they'd been told was in them. Eleanor testified after him, and was quieter and more devastating, because there was nothing in her testimony that sounded like grievance. It sounded like a record. She was not angry on the stand. She was precise. Victor's lawyer objected 4 times. Merritt overruled all 4. Dr. Webb testified about the nature of Billy's condition, about the research that supported home-based care over institutionalization for children with his particular profile, and about what, in his professional opinion, removing a child like Billy from a stable and loving home environment would do to that child. "Irreversible harm," he said. "That is not hyperbole. That is a clinical finding." Then Merritt looked at Victor's table. "Petitioner, you filed this petition 6 weeks after retaining Dr. Aldrich of Colton Creek as a consulting witness. Dr. Aldrich is not present today." Victor's lead lawyer said carefully. "Dr. Aldrich became unavailable." "He became unavailable," Merritt said, "after it came to light that his retainer predated the welfare complaint by several weeks, which raises the question of whether this petition was generated in response to a genuine welfare concern or in anticipation of manufacturing one." He looked at Victor directly. "Mr. Weston, you have a legal history with this property going back to a contested will. You have a documented pattern, and I have reviewed the Callaway case materials which were submitted to this court this morning of using welfare petitions as a precursor to land acquisition." He set down his papers. "I am not inclined to characterize the relationship between those facts as coincidental." Victor's jaw was tight. For the first time since Jack had known him, he looked like a man whose calculations had failed him. "The petition for emergency guardianship is denied," Merritt said. The room exhaled. Furthermore, Merritt continued, and the room went quiet again. "I am referring the matter of the Callaway land transaction and the conduct of the attorneys involved to the Territorial Bar for review. And I am placing a notation in this court's record that any future welfare petition involving the minor child William Weston, filed by Victor Weston or any party associated with him, will be reviewed with particular scrutiny." He looked at Victor one more time. "We are adjourned." The gavel came down. Jack stood very still for a moment after the sound of it. Then Hector's hand was on his shoulder, and Martha Hale was saying something to Lena that Jack couldn't quite hear, and Thomas Callaway was across the room looking at Jack with an expression that was grief and relief mixed together in a way that had no clean name. Jack crossed the room and extended his hand. Thomas took it. "Thank you," Jack said. "We should have had someone to do this for us," Thomas said. "I'm glad you did." Eleanor was beside him. She looked at Jack for a moment and then said quietly, "Your boy, is he all right?" "He's home," Jack said. "He's always been all right. We just had to make sure the world knew that." She nodded, and something in her face closed gently, like a letter being folded away. They were the last to leave the courtroom. The crowd had filtered out in the particular way courthouse crowds did, quickly and with relief, and by the time Jack and Lena went down the stairs and out into the August heat, the street was already returning to its ordinary business. Victor was gone. He had left without a word, which told Jack more than any parting speech would have. A man who left quietly was a man who was already planning his next move, and Jack knew that. Victor was not finished, not entirely. But the ground had shifted. The court had seen what he was, and seeing had a way of sticking. They rode home mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence from the one on the way out. That silence had been full of what might go wrong. This one was full of what had happened and what it meant, and neither of them had the right words for it yet. When the ranch came up the road and the house came into view, Billy was on the porch steps. Mrs. Adler was behind him, and she raised her hand in a wave that said she was relinquishing her post. Billy was looking at the road. He had his 3 stones in his hand. He watched them ride up, watched Jack climb down, watched Lena climb down. Then he walked down the porch steps and stood in front of them, and looked at Jack's face for a long moment, reading it the way he read everything, not the surface of it, but what was underneath. Whatever he found there made him nod. Once. Small and certain. "It's done," Jack said. "We're staying." Billy held out his hand. Not to Jack. To Lena. In his palm were all 3 stones. Lena looked at them. She looked at Billy. And then very slowly she reached out and took them from him, all 3, the full weight of them, and held them in both hands. Billy watched her hold them. Then he reached up, a movement that surprised everyone, including Jack suspected Billy himself, and touched her hand once with 2 fingers. Brief and deliberate. Then he turned and went back up the porch steps and inside, humming in that register that meant everything was exactly as it should be. Lena stood in the yard with 3 stones in her hands, and her eyes bright with something she was choosing not to let fall. Jack stood beside her and looked at the stones, and then at her. "That's the first time he's ever reached out to touch somebody," he said. His voice was rough and real, and he didn't bother trying to smooth it. "Anybody. In 12 years. She didn't answer for a moment. She closed her fingers around the stones carefully and looked up at the porch where Billy had disappeared through the door. "He knows what family feels like," she said. "He's known for a while. He was just waiting for us to catch up." Jack looked at her, and in the August heat on the dirt drive of a ranch at the foot of a mountain, with the stones of his son's trust in her hands and the sound of Billy humming through the open window above them, Jack Weston did something he had not done in 4 years. He reached out and took her free hand in his, held it, didn't let go. She let him. They stood like that for a while in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through something real together and come out the other side, still standing, still choosing, still holding on. That evening the 3 of them sat on the back porch, Jack in his chair, Billy on the top step with his stones, Lena beside Jack with her mending. She wasn't really doing, and the mountain went from amber to purple to black in the way it had always done, indifferent and vast and steady as anything Jack had ever known. Billy hummed. Not the distress hum, not the attention hum. The other one. The one Jack had heard his whole life and loved without knowing exactly what it was until now. It was the sound of a person who was home. And Jack Weston, the man who had stopped going to the station, who had sent his ranch hand because he couldn't stand to hold hope in his chest one more time, leaned back in his chair with his wife beside him and his son at his feet and the mountain at his back, and understood with the bone-deep certainty of something that had stopped needing to be examined, that the life he'd been bracing against losing was the life he had finally fully chosen to live. They had come for his son. They had come for his land. They had come with lawyers and county letters and a system designed to make a man feel small enough to give up. He had not given up, and neither had she. And that was the thing that no court and no petition and no man in a pressed suit on a polished horse could ever touch. Not the land, not the legal victory, not even the stones in her hand. What they could not touch was this: a boy humming on a porch step in the dark, and two people who had decided every single day to stay.